You've killed my sister! The words tore through the phone speaker like a jagged blade, followed by a sound I had never heard from my husband before, a primal, animalistic scream of pure, unfiltered terror. The receiver slipped from my trembling fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. But even from the ground, I could still hear his frantic, ragged breathing. I stood absolutely frozen in the center of our dimly lit living room, my heart hammering against my ribs so violently I thought it might shatter them. Upstairs, the agonizing wails of my mother-in-law echoed down the staircase, slicing through the heavy silence of the house. "Claire, my baby! Please, God, wake up! Somebody help her!" And all of this chaos, this sudden, terrifying descent into an absolute nightmare, was because of a piece of clothing. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling uncontrollably. Just moments ago, I had been holding a stunning jade green silk dress. It was a surprise delivery, my second wedding anniversary gift from my loving, soft-spoken husband, Matt. When I first opened the delicate box and felt the cool, expensive fabric against my skin, I thought it was a token of his deep affection. I thought it was proof that after 2 years of enduring his mother's endless emotional abuse and living like an unpaid servant in their massive Connecticut home, I finally had something that proved my husband truly cherished me. I couldn't have been more wrong. That dress wasn't a romantic gift. It was a weapon, a carefully calculated psychological trigger. And my husband, the man I shared a bed with, the man I trusted with my life, had knowingly used me to pull the pin when my fragile 25-year-old sister-in-law Claire saw that pale green fabric draped over my arms. Her eyes dilated in pure, unadulterated horror. She didn't just panic. She dropped to the floor, her body thrashing in violent, uncontrollable spasms. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and thick, white foam began to bubble at the corners of her lips as if she were literally dying of fright right in front of me. I didn't know it at that exact second, but that gorgeous dress was an exact replica of the one a dead girl wore 10 years ago on a rainy afternoon on the Merritt Parkway. A girl who was violently crushed to death under the tires of a speeding car. For an entire decade, my husband and his mother had spun a web of deception so thick, so deeply sinister, that it turned a healthy teenage girl into a heavily medicated prisoner in her own bedroom. They convinced her, and the world, that she was a cold-blooded murderer. They locked her behind secretly barred windows, fed her high-dose antipsychotics disguised as daily herbal tonics, and kept her trapped in a perpetual state of guilt, fear, and horrifying hallucinations. And Matt, my sweet, protective, perfectly normal Matt, was the true mastermind behind the wheel that day, and the architect of her 10-year imprisonment. I was just the naive new wife, the perfect, disposable pawn brought into this house of horrors to unknowingly test a superstitious curse. He wanted to see if the sight of that jade green silk would finally push his sister over the edge of insanity. As the wailing upstairs grew louder, mixing with the screeching tires of my husband's car furiously tearing up the driveway, the horrifying reality washed over me. The peaceful marriage I thought I had was a complete fabrication. But as I stared at the crumpled jade green silk lying on the cold floor like a pool of stagnant water, the terror gripping my throat slowly morphed into a chilling realization. If they were willing to chemically lobotomize and imprison their own flesh and blood to bury the truth of a fatal hit and run, what on earth were they going to do to me now that I had unwittingly stumbled right into the very center of their dark, twisted stage? The front door burst open with a violent crash. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded against the floorboards, coming straight for me. I had to make a choice. Right then and there, become the next victim in this house of secrets, or find a way to tear their perfect lies apart. The hardwood floor vibrated beneath my bare feet. 3 seconds. That was exactly how much time I had before the man I had slept next to for over 700 nights rounded the corner into the living room. 3 seconds to understand that the rules of my entire survival had just been completely rewritten. This wasn't a domestic dispute. This wasn't a misunderstanding over a tasteless anniversary present. This was a collision with a monster who had just realized his cage was left unlocked. You have to understand the sheer paralyzing magnitude of this exact fraction of a second. Think about it. Think about the person you trust most in this world, the one who holds you when you cry, the one who promises to protect you. Now imagine realizing they are a phantom, a hollow suit of skin worn by a sociopath who didn't blink at systematically destroying his own teenage sister's mind just to save himself from a prison cell. If Matt could do that to Claire, his own flesh and blood, the little girl he grew up with, what was he capable of doing to me? I wasn't blood. I was a nobody, a naive middle-class outsider who possessed zero leverage, zero wealth, and absolutely no power against this prominent coastal family. I was a prop in their twisted theater, and props are easily disposed of when the show is over. My mind raced through the terrifying calculus of my reality. We lived on a secluded estate. The nearest neighbor was acres away, completely shielded by thick Connecticut woods. My mother-in-law, Helen, was upstairs. I already an active co-conspirator in a decade-long cover-up. It was 2 against 1. If Matt came around that corner and decided right here, right now, that I had figured out the morbid significance of that jade green dress, I wouldn't make it out the front door. People like Matt don't just confess when they're caught. They double down. They eliminate the threat. What would be my fate? Would I suffer a sudden, tragic fall down that grand, sweeping staircase? Would they pin me down and force-feed me the same antipsychotic cocktails they'd been shoving down Claire's throat? I could perfectly picture Helen locking me in a guest room, telling the world the new bride couldn't handle the pressure and suffered a tragic psychotic break. Who would question them? They were wealthy. They were respected. They had already successfully buried a dead body and bought their way out of vehicular manslaughter. Disposing of a problematic wife would be child's play. The heavy thud of his shoes slapped against the foyer tile. He was breathing like a hunted predator, harsh, wet, and frantic. I stared at the crumpled green silk on the floor. It was a neon sign pointing directly to his guilt. I couldn't hide it. I couldn't unring the bell. Every single choice I had ever made in my 30 years of life culminated in this one suffocating heartbeat. If my face betrayed even a fraction of the horror and clarity that was currently screaming through my veins, he would know instantly. He would look into my eyes and see that his blindly obedient wife was dead, and a witness had taken her place. And witnesses do not survive in this house. The shadow of his towering frame stretched across the living room wall, cast by the dim glow of the hallway sconce. He was here. The oxygen in the room seemed to evaporate, leaving me choking on pure adrenaline. My life, my sanity, and the justice for a girl dead 10 years, and another buried alive upstairs, all hung in the balance of how I played the next 5 seconds. I dropped to my knees. The sudden movement sent a sharp ache through my kneecaps as they struck the hardwood, but I didn't care. I grabbed the crumpled jade green silk, deliberately bunching it into a messy, frustrated ball, just as Matt's shadow eclipsed the doorway. I didn't look at him with terror. I didn't look at him with the cold, calculating eyes of a woman who had just realized she was married to a murderer. I dug deep into the reservoir of my own exhaustion. I channeled every ounce of the genuine misery I had felt over the last 3 years in this house, and looked up at him with red, tear-filled eyes. "I'm throwing it away!" I shouted, my voice cracking perfectly, hitting that precise octave of a wife pushed to her absolute emotional limit. I threw the balled-up silk onto the coffee table. "Are you happy now, Matt? Your mother screamed at me. You screamed at me like a lunatic over the phone, and for what? Over a stupid piece of fabric? If you all hate me so much, why did you even marry me? I buried my face in my hands and forced my shoulders to heave with violent, jagged sobs. The silence that followed was the heaviest, most agonizing weight I had ever endured. I could hear his ragged breathing. I could feel the heat radiating from his towering frame as he stepped into the room. He was assessing me. The predator was scanning the prey for a pulse of danger. If I had flinched, if I had frozen, if I had shown a single flicker of the horrific clarity burning in my mind, he would have known. But by throwing a tantrum, by leaning into the stereotype of the hysterical, emotionally wounded woman who just wanted her husband's validation, I was giving him exactly what he expected to see. I was giving him a problem he knew how to manage. Slow, heavy footsteps approached. Then the rustle of his expensive suit pants as he knelt beside me on the floor. Strong, familiar arms wrapped around my shaking shoulders. He pulled me into his chest, burying his face in my hair. The scent of his Tom Ford cologne filled my lungs, mixed with the faint, sour tang of his panic sweat. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice suddenly smooth, so entirely devoid of the feral rage I had heard on the phone. The monster was retracting its claws, sliding back into the human suit. "I'm so sorry, Sophia. Shh. It's okay. I didn't mean to yell. It's just that dress. It belonged to someone Claire lost a long time ago. A very bad memory. Seeing it triggered her, and it panicked me. I overreacted. It was a brilliant lie. So effortless, so practiced. As I sat there, pressed against the chest of a man who had left a girl to bleed out on a rainy asphalt road 10 years ago, I realized something profound about the world we live in. We are all conditioned from birth to believe in a very specific set of fairy tales. We are taught that monsters lurk in dark, graffiti-covered alleys, not in million-dollar estates in coastal Connecticut. While we believe that evil announces itself with a sinister laugh, not with a gentle kiss on the forehead. Society feeds us the illusion of the perfect marriage. You find a successful, handsome man from a respectable family. You see his tailored suits, his polished smile, the way he holds the door for you, and the way his family donates to local charities. You look at the manicured lawns, the country club memberships, the crystal chandeliers, and you subconsciously equate wealth and status with morality. We inherently trust the shiny surface. We believe that if a man works a prestigious job and speaks with a soft, reassuring cadence, he is a protector. This is the great American illusion. The belief that danger is always an external force trying to break into your house, rather than the person who holds the key to the front door. Women are taught to seek this exact kind of safety, to anchor our lives to men like Matthew, believing their strength will be our shield. When you are enveloped in the arms of a husband who provides for you, the societal script dictates that you are safe, but it's a terrifyingly fragile script. Because as Matt stroked my hair, murmuring sweet, apologetic nothings into my ear, I knew the absolute, undeniable truth. The arms currently holding me were the exact same arms that had dragged a bleeding, dying girl's bicycle into a ditch. The soothing voice calming my fake tears was the same voice that systematically ordered the chemical lobotomy of his own sister just to protect his stock portfolio and family name. "I'll get rid of it," Matt said softly, reaching over me to grab the jade green silk from the table. He didn't look at it. He handled it like it was radioactive. "You'll never have to see it again. I promise. Just let it go, okay, honey? Let's just forget today happened." "Okay," I sniffled, wiping my eyes, playing the role of the pacified wife to the very last beat. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "I know you didn't." He smiled, kissing my temple. "I love you, Sophia." "I love you too," I whispered back. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. He stood up, taking the dress with him, and walked toward the kitchen to pour himself a drink. The immediate threat had passed. I had survived the 5 seconds that mattered most. The cage door had swung shut again, and the monster believed I was still happily locked inside with him, entirely blind to the bars. But as the days slowly turned into weeks, the reality of my survival began to morph into a new, suffocating kind of psychological torture. I had to wake up every morning, fry eggs, and pour coffee for a sociopath. I had to sit at the sprawling mahogany dining table and politely pass the butter to Helen, a mother who was actively poisoning her own daughter to protect her son's legacy. I lived in a museum of horrors, forced to play the role of the clueless, slightly clumsy daughter-in-law. Everything returned to its normal state. Helen continued to scold me for breathing too loudly. Matt continued to go to work, kissing my cheek before he left. Claire remained a ghost, locked in her room with the iron-barred windows, staring blankly at the walls through a heavy haze of antipsychotics. To anyone looking from the outside, we were just a quiet, affluent family dealing with the tragic burden of a mentally fragile daughter. That was the narrative. That was the impenetrable shield of respectability they had built. I watched them closely. I watched the way Helen meticulously measured out Claire's herbal tea. I watched the way Matt casually signed massive checks for the private pharmacy that delivered Claire's off-the-books prescriptions. I watched the flawless, mechanical efficiency with which this family operated their deception. And that was when a new, creeping dread began to pool at the base of my spine. The hit and run 10 years ago was a crime of panic. It was a tragedy born of a reckless, impulsive young man making a horrific choice in the rain. But what I was witnessing now, the doctors on the payroll, the customized iron-barred windows, the precise chemical cocktails, the seamless coordination between mother and son, was not panic. It was infrastructure. You don't build an infrastructure this elaborate, this heavily funded, and this flawlessly executed just to cover up a single traffic accident from a decade ago. As I stood in the hallway one evening, listening to the muffled, chillingly calm voices of Matt and Helen discussing a dosage adjustment behind closed doors, a terrifying realization shattered my understanding of the situation. I thought I had solved the mystery. I thought the jade green dress and the dead girl on the Merritt Parkway were the bottom of the abyss. But looking at the cold, calculated efficiency of the monsters I lived with, I realized the horrifying truth. The accident wasn't the end of their secrets. It was just the beginning. I had been looking at this all wrong. I had been staring at the tragedy through the lens of guilt and panic, assuming that the iron bars and the chemical restraints were merely a desperate, sprawling cover-up to keep a traumatized witness quiet. But dead girls don't require a multi-million-dollar infrastructure. A secret from a decade ago only needs a shallow grave, a tight alibi, and silence. You don't put a team of private, high-end psychiatrists on a permanent retainer just to hide a hit and run. You don't turn your own coastal estate into a heavily guarded psychiatric ward out of mere self-preservation. You do it for control, and in a family like Matthew's, control only meant one thing: money. The pacing of my own heartbeat began to thud in my ears, a frantic, rhythmic drum pulling me out of my paralyzing fear and thrusting me into a cold, hyper-focused clarity. If this wasn't about hiding the accident from the police, then who were they hiding Claire from? I needed to see the paperwork. Every piece of mail that entered this house was meticulously intercepted by Helen. Every bank statement, every legal notice, every tax document was whisked away into Matthew's home office, the one room in the house that was strictly off-limits, guarded by a heavy oak door and a digital keypad lock. But Matthew was a creature of ego, and arrogant men always leave footprints. I waited until 2 a.m., long after the heavy, drunken snores began vibrating through the walls of Matthew's temporary bedroom. I crept down the hallway, the hardwood floors freezing against my bare feet. I bypassed the living room and went straight to his office door. The keypad glowed a faint, clinical blue in the dark. I didn't try our anniversary. I didn't try my birthday, or his, or even his mother's. Sociopaths don't commemorate the people they view as props. They commemorate their victories. They immortalize the moments they claimed their power. My trembling fingers hovered over the keys. I punched in the date of the accident on the Merritt Parkway, 101416. A soft mechanical click echoed through the silent corridor. The light turned green. The door unlocked. I slipped inside, shutting the door behind me and relying only on the narrow beam of my phone's flashlight. The office was immaculate, smelling faintly of leather and aged paper. I didn't bother with the desk drawers. I went straight for the heavy steel safe bolted into the floor of the closet. The key for it was exactly where I knew it would be, tucked inside the false bottom of his humidor on the bookshelf. A trick I had watched him use once when he thought I was asleep on the couch. I turned the key, threw the heavy bolts, and pulled the safe open. It wasn't filled with cash or heirlooms. It was stuffed with thick manila legal folders. I pulled the first stack out, my eyes scanning the bold black print at the top of the documents. It wasn't about the car accident. It wasn't a police report. It was a probate court filing. The last will and testament of Richard Sterling, my father-in-law, the man who had supposedly died of a sudden, tragic heart attack mere months after the hit and run. I had never met him, but I knew the family lore. His death had shattered the family, leaving Matthew to step up and take control of the estate. But as my eyes darted across the pages, the grand illusion of the devoted son burned to ash. Sir Richard Sterling hadn't left the estate to Matthew. He hadn't left a single dime to Helen either. There, stamped and notarized in irrefutable legal ink, was a codicil added exactly 3 weeks after Lucy Alvarez bled to death on the asphalt. Richard knew. He knew his son was driving. He knew Helen helped cover it up. And as his final damning act of judgment, Richard had entirely disinherited his wife and his son. Sole beneficiary, Claire Sterling. The sum attached to the bottom of the trust documents made my breath catch in my throat. $45 million. Every property, every offshore account, the stock portfolios, the coastal estate, it all belonged exclusively to Claire. But there was a catch. A legal loophole wide enough to drive a wedge of pure evil through. If Claire were ever deemed mentally incapacitated, if she were diagnosed as a danger to herself and incapable of managing her own affairs, control of the trust would default to a state-appointed conservator. I frantically dug deeper into the safe, pulling out the next folder, Conservatorship Decree. Appointed conservators, Helen Sterling and Matthew Sterling. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a violence that made me physically nauseous. The iron bars, the isolation, the heavy, mind-numbing antipsychotics disguised as herbal tea. They weren't hiding a murder. They were perpetrating a $45 million hostage situation. They had legally kidnapped Claire in her own home. If Claire ever got better, if she ever woke up from her medically induced fog and proved to a judge that she was sane, the conservatorship would end. Helen and Matthew would lose everything. They would be left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the looming threat of a reopened vehicular manslaughter investigation. They didn't just need Claire to be quiet. They needed her to be clinically, irreversibly insane. My eyes darted to the dates on the psychiatric evaluations. Every 6 months, a court-mandated doctor from the state came to the house to evaluate Claire's competency, to see if the conservatorship was still necessary. I scrambled to find Matthew's leather-bound desk calendar, flipping the pages to the current week. There it was, circled in red ink. Thursday, 10 a.m., state evaluation, Dr. Aris. Thursday, tomorrow. The realization hit me like a freight train. The air was suddenly sucked out of the room. My mind flashed back to the jade green dress, the beautiful, way expensive silk gift delivered to me just days before Matthew left on his business trip. The dress that was the exact replica of the one the dead girl had been wearing. Matthew hadn't given me that dress to test a curse. He hadn't given it to me out of some twisted sense of guilt. He gave it to me because he knew I would try it on. He knew I would walk out into the hallway. He knew Claire would see me. It was a scheduled, calculated psychological trigger. They needed Claire to have a violent, undeniable psychotic break right before the state evaluator arrived. They needed fresh, terrifying documentation that she was a danger to herself, hallucinating dead girls and screaming in terror. And they couldn't just tell her about the accident. They needed a visual catalyst to shatter her fragile psyche completely. I wasn't the guinea pig in some cruel experiment. I was the syringe. I was the weapon they used to inject a lethal dose of trauma directly into Claire's veins. They had weaponized my innocence, turning me into the ghost of the girl Matthew had murdered, all so they could point to Claire's agonizing breakdown and tell the judge, "Look how sick she is. Look how she hallucinates. We must maintain control of the estate." A profound, terrifying silence settled over me in the dark office. The fear that had dictated my every move for the past 3 years evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating, predatory rage. They thought they were the only ones who knew how to play a role. They thought they had perfectly conditioned me to be the submissive, oblivious wife. They had severely underestimated what happens when a pawn realizes it's on the board. The accident wasn't just the beginning of their secrets, it was the beginning of their end. I wasn't going to run to the police with a stack of old clippings. I was going to let the state evaluator walk through those doors tomorrow morning. I was going to let Matthew and Helen play their perfect, tragic roles. And then I was going to burn their entire empire to the ground. I stood in the suffocating silence of Matthew's office, the blueprints of their $45 million hostage situation still heavy in my trembling hands. I thought I had uncovered the absolute bottom of their depravity. I thought the greed, the drugs, and the psychological torture were the final layers of this nightmare. But as my flashlight swept over the back pages of the conservatorship file, a glaring, horrifying anomaly caught the light. A detail so seamlessly woven into the legal jargon that it almost slipped past my adrenaline-soaked mind. The secondary beneficiary clause. If Claire died, the estate didn't automatically revert to Matthew. His father had made sure of that. The money would be tied up in a heavily monitored state trust, subject to rigorous audits. Matthew and Helen needed Claire alive but completely incapacitated to maintain their unlimited access to the accounts. But there was an addendum, a highly specific legal caveat regarding the termination of the conservatorship. If the state found evidence of gross negligence or abuse by the primary caretakers, they would be stripped of their power, investigated, and potentially prosecuted. They were running a massive illegal pharmaceutical operation right under the state's nose. If a doctor, a nurse, or a random evaluator like Dr. Aris ever looked too closely at Claire's blood work, the entire empire would instantly shatter. They needed an insurance policy. They needed a buffer. My flashlight beam trembled as it landed on a stack of pharmacy receipts and medical logs tucked beneath the legal decrees. I stared at the signature line on the bottom of every single delivery invoice for the past 2 years. It wasn't Helen's elegant cursive. It wasn't Matthew's sharp scrawl. It was my signature, the deliveries that came to the door while Matthew was at work, the special tea blends Helen casually asked me to sign for when her hands were full in the kitchen. So the times Matthew asked me to run to the boutique pharmacy downtown to pick up Claire's vitamins. My name was on everything. The unspoken truth of my marriage slammed into my chest, stealing the oxygen from my lungs. I wasn't just a psychological trigger dressed in jade green silk. I wasn't just a convenient, isolated woman with no family to miss her. I was the ultimate scapegoat. They weren't just securing their empire tomorrow morning. They were setting me up for elder and dependent abuse. If Dr. Aris found Claire in a state of toxic psychosis, Matthew and Helen would play the weeping, devastated family. They would point their trembling fingers at the jealous, unhinged wife who had slowly taken over Claire's care. They would show the state evaluator the delivery logs with my signature. So they would pull out the herbal tea they had watched me serve her. I was meant to go to federal prison so they could keep the gold. The clock on Matthew's mahogany desk glowed blood red in the dark, 3:14 a.m. The state evaluator was arriving at 10. I had less than 7 hours to dismantle a decade-long conspiracy. The pacing of my heartbeat shifted from a frantic flutter to a steady, lethal drum of pure survival. I shoved the files back into the steel safe, memorizing every forged timeline, every dosage, every damning date, and locked it. I wiped the keypad with the hem of my shirt. I didn't creep back to my bedroom to pack a bag. Running would only prove their fabricated narrative. I moved with the silent, desperate speed of a woman backed against a cliff edge. I headed straight for Claire's room. I bypassed the heavy iron lock using the spare key I still kept hidden in my pocket. The door opened with a faint, metallic click. The room was bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp filtering through the iron bars on the window. I stepped inside, expecting to find her curled under the blankets, lost in a chemically induced stupor, drooling onto her pillow as she always did. Instead, my breath hitched, and the flashlight nearly slipped from my grip. Claire was sitting perfectly upright on the edge of her hospital bed in the dark. She wasn't staring blankly at the wall. She wasn't trembling. Her posture was rigidly straight, and her eyes, those usually vacant, terror-stricken eyes, were locked onto me in the shadows with a piercing, terrifying lucidity. She raised her right hand. Slowly, deliberately, she uncurled her fingers. In the center of her pale palm lay a crumpled, damp tissue. Resting inside it were 6 white, chalky pills, the antipsychotics. She hadn't been swallowing them. "It took you long enough, Sophia," she whispered. Her voice was entirely devoid of the childlike broken tremor she had weaponized for years. It was cold, sharp, brilliant. I froze, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. I stared at the girl I thought I was supposed to save, the tragic victim I had been crying over for weeks. The ultimate unspoken truth of this house wasn't just that Matthew and Helen were monsters. It was that you don't survive 10 years in a cage with monsters without learning how to bite back. You're not, I stammered, the words caught in a throat paralyzed by shock. Insane? Claire finished for me, her lips curling into a grim, humorless smile. She walked over to the small potted fern on her windowsill and casually pressed the damp pills deep into the soil, burying them alongside dozens of others. I haven't swallowed their poison in 8 months. I learned how to hide them under my tongue. I learned how to mimic the eye tremors. I learned exactly how much drool makes Helen feel like she's in complete control. But the evaluation, I whispered, stepping closer, my mind spinning violently to catch up with this new reality. The breakdown you had over the green dress, the screaming, was an audition, Claire said smoothly, turning to face me. If I suddenly acted sane, they would have just brought a doctor in the middle of the night to inject me directly. I needed them to think they were winning. I needed them to get arrogant. And I needed a witness. She stepped into the sliver of moonlight, and for the first time, I saw the fierce, calculating intelligence of the Yale student she used to be. "I saw you take the tea sample to Alvarez," she murmured, stepping dangerously close to me. "I watched you through the crack in the door when you found my rag doll. I knew you were finally seeing the strings. But we don't have time to celebrate your detective skills, Sophia. Tomorrow at 10, Dr. Aris isn't coming just to do a routine evaluation. He's on Matthew's payroll. He's coming to sign the medical authorization to permanently commit me to a private, closed-ward facility out of state. If I get in the car with him tomorrow, I will never see the sun again. And you will be the one holding the smoking gun." The walls of the room felt like they were rapidly closing in. The sheer velocity of the deception was dizzying. "I know," I breathed rapidly. "I saw the delivery logs, my signature. They're going to frame me for your toxicity." "Exactly," Claire nodded, her eyes flashing with a predatory gleam. "So, we don't just stop them, we trap them." She reached under her mattress and pulled out a small, sleek black rectangle, a digital audio recorder with a microtransmitter. "I bought this online using Matthew's credit card information 3 months ago and intercepted the package. I've been recording every conversation they have when they think I'm comatose in my bed," Claire said, pressing the device into my palm. "But audio isn't enough to break a conservatorship and put a wealthy man in prison. We need a confession. We need them to admit to the poisoning, to the framing, to the embezzlement, with the state evaluator standing right there. How? I asked, my hands shaking as I gripped the cold plastic of the recorder. They're too careful. Matthew is too meticulous. Arrogant men only make mistakes when they think their prey is dead, Claire said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Tomorrow morning, you're not going to serve me the tea. You're going to serve it to Helen. My eyes widened. The sheer audacity of the plan sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight into my heart. And while she's losing her mind, Claire continued, her gaze burning into mine, I am going to put on that jade green dress. I'm going to walk down those stairs looking exactly like the ghost Matthew tried to bury. We are going to give them the exact psychotic break they paid for. Only they won't be the ones directing the play. I looked at the digital clock on her nightstand. 4:12 a.m. The world outside was pitch black, completely unaware of the explosive reckoning brewing inside this fortress of lies. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. The frightened, obedient wife had died in Matthew's office an hour ago. Get dressed, I told Claire, slipping the recorder into my pocket and turning toward the door. I'm going to start boiling the water. There is a universally accepted script for what a woman is supposed to do when she realizes she is sleeping under the same roof as a monster. If you watch any true crime documentary, read any thriller, or ask any armchair detective, the advice is always identical. You wait until the house is dead silent. You pack a duffel bag in the dark. You grab your keys, you sneak out the back door, and you run. You drive straight to the nearest police station. You slam your hands on the precinct desk, and you beg the authorities for protection. You trust the system to save you. But that is the fatal flaw of conventional thinking. It is a romanticized, naive delusion born from people who have never actually been hunted by the elite. If I had followed that standard script, if I had panicked, thrown some clothes into a bag, and fled into the Connecticut night, I would have been in handcuffs before sunrise. Matthew was a wealthy, respected businessman. Helen was a high society matriarch. And I was just the emotionally erratic wife. If I ran, Matthew wouldn't even have to chase me. He would simply call the police, his voice dripping with faux husbandly concern, and tell them his wife was having a severe mental breakdown. He would invite the detectives into his immaculate home, open his steel safe, and hand them the delivery logs bearing my forged signatures. He would show them the antipsychotics hidden in my bedside drawer. By running, I wouldn't be escaping. I would be handing them the exact narrative they needed to validate my guilt. The legal system doesn't listen to terrified, hysterical women running through the dark. It listens to calm, well-dressed men in tailored suits holding impeccable paper trails. The conventional method of seeking justice relies on the assumption that the truth is enough to set you free. It isn't. When you are fighting a $45 million empire, the truth is entirely irrelevant. The only thing that matters is who controls the stage. That is where Claire and I broke the rules of engagement. We didn't choose flight, and we didn't choose a frontal assault. We chose asymmetrical psychological warfare. You don't escape a burning house when the exits are barricaded by billionaires. You lock the doors from the inside, you change the locks, and you hand them the gasoline. You use their absolute, unwavering arrogance as the weapon of their own destruction. I moved silently down the sprawling mahogany staircase, the cold hardwood grounding the electric buzz of adrenaline humming beneath my skin. The kitchen was bathed in the metallic bluish light of the microwave clock. 4:45 a.m. So I opened the heavy oak pantry and reached for Helen's private stash of loose-leaf chamomile and lavender. For 3 years, I had watched her prepare this exact brew for Claire, infusing it with the heavy, mind-altering sedatives that turned a brilliant Yale student into a drooling, catatonic ghost. Helen's process was meticulous. It was clinical. It was the routine of a woman who felt nothing but the godlike supremacy of total control. Narcissists like Helen and Matthew possess a crippling blind spot. They fundamentally believe they are the only ones capable of writing the script. They view everyone else as NPCs, non-playable characters, existing solely to react to their stimuli. Helen believed I was a clumsy, subservient idiot who couldn't even boil water to her exact specifications. Matthew believed I was a desperate, still love-starved wife who could be easily placated with a hug and a lie. Because they saw me as a prop, they never bothered to look at my hands. I set the kettle on the stove and turned the gas dial. A ring of blue fire flared to life in the dark. From my pocket, I pulled out the small, crumpled tissue Claire had handed me upstairs. Inside rested 14 chalky, high-potency antipsychotic pills, a concentrated stockpile she had hidden under her tongue and spat out over the last 2 weeks. Normally, a victim would take these pills straight to a lab. A conventional thinker would bag them as evidence to show a judge. But Claire and I knew better. Evidence can be disputed by expensive lawyers. A confession, however, extracted in the midst of a chemically induced screaming panic attack in front of a state-appointed medical evaluator? That was bulletproof. I grabbed a heavy marble mortar and pestle from the counter. I dumped the 14 pills into the bowl and began to grind them. The chalky white spheres cracked and yielded, crumbling into a fine, powdery dust. With every rotation of the pestle, I pulverized the last 3 years of my subjugation. I ground down the gaslighting, the fake apologies, the cruel scoldings, and the sheer terror of realizing my signature had been forged for a felony. I scooped the pristine white powder and dumped it directly into Helen's personal gold-rimmed teacup. I poured a splash of boiling water over it, watching the heavy sedatives dissolve invisibly into the ceramic bottom. Then I added the chamomile, the lavender, and a heavy spoonful of local honey to mask the chemical bitterness. It was a masterpiece of reverse engineering. We were taking the very infrastructure of their abuse and turning it inward. By 7:15 a.m., the house began to wake. I heard the heavy thud of Matthew's footsteps overhead, followed by the shower running. He was prepping for his big day. Today was the day he would permanently commit his sister, seize total control of her trust fund, and solidify my position as his fall guy. At 7:45 a.m., Helen descended the stairs. She was dressed in her usual immaculate cashmere sweater and pressed slacks, every gray hair perfectly sprayed into place. She walked into the kitchen, the sharp clack of her heels announcing her authority. "You're up early," she snapped, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of me standing by the island. "I hope you haven't ruined the kitchen." "Doctor, what heiress will be here at 10 sharp? The house needs to be flawless." "I know, Helen," I replied, keeping my voice incredibly soft, perfectly modulating the tone of a cowed, anxious daughter-in-law. I didn't meet her eyes. I let my shoulders slump, playing the exact character she demanded. "I just wanted to help. I know today is stressful for you. I made your tea." I turned and pushed the gold-rimmed porcelain cup across the granite island toward her. A wisp of floral steam curled into the cold morning air. Helen stopped. She looked at the cup, then looked at me, a smirk of profound disdain pulling at the corner of her mouth. It was the look of a monarch acknowledging a peasant's tribute. She didn't suspect a thing. Why would she? To her, I was too weak, too dependent, and too stupid to ever strike back. "At least you're learning to make yourself useful," she muttered coldly. She picked up the cup. She brought the porcelain rim to her lips. She closed her eyes, took a long, deep sip, and swallowed. I stood 2 feet away, my hands clasped respectfully in front of me, watching the woman who had orchestrated my imprisonment voluntarily swallow a massive, concentrated dose of her own chemical lobotomy. "Make sure Matthew's briefcase is by the door," Helen ordered, taking another heavy gulp of the laced tea before turning her back to me to look out the window. "And stay out of the way when the doctor arrives. The adults need to handle Claire today." "Of course, Helen," I whispered. "I'll stay right out of your way." I watched her drain the last drop from the cup. The clock on the microwave ticked to 8 a.m. The poison was in the bloodstream. The stage was set. The conventional playbook was burning in the fireplace. Now, all Claire and I had to do was wait for the curtain to rise and watch the elite directors of this tragedy choke on their own script. By 8:30 a.m., the first microscopic cracks in their polished facade began to show. Helen was standing by the pristine marble countertop, attempting to arrange a platter of imported pastries for the doctor's arrival. I watched from the sink, scrubbing a perfectly clean plate as her hand hovered over a silver pair of tongs. Her fingers twitched. She reached for the tongs, but her grip faltered, and the heavy silver clattered loudly onto the marble. She blinked, a flash of genuine confusion crossing her sharp features. She flexed her hand, staring at her own fingers as if they belonged to a stranger. The chemical payload was crossing the blood-brain barrier. 14 doses of a high-potency antipsychotic designed to sedate a healthy 25-year-old woman into a waking coma were now flooding the nervous system of a 65-year-old woman. "Are you all right, Helen?" I asked, my voice the perfect pitch of meek, daughterly concern. "Fine," she snapped, though her tongue seemed just a fraction too thick, the word slurring softly at the edges. She braced her hands against the counter, closing her eyes as a visible bead of sweat broke out on her powdered forehead. "Just a sudden migraine. The stress of dealing with Claire is simply exhausting." "Why don't you sit down?" I offered, stepping closer. "I can finish the platter." She didn't argue. That was the most terrifying indicator of how rapidly the drugs were taking hold. The Helen I knew would have slapped my hand away and delivered a 10-minute lecture on my incompetence. Instead, she swayed slightly on her designer heels and heavily lowered herself into one of the velvet dining chairs, rubbing her temples. At 9 a.m., Matthew descended the staircase. He looked immaculate. His charcoal suit was tailored to perfection, his tie a muted, respectful navy blue, the exact uniform of a burdened, responsible patriarch ready to make the hardest medical decision of his life for his severely ill sister. He walked into the dining room, adjusting his cuffs, entirely absorbed in his own reflection in the hallway mirror. He didn't look closely at his mother. He didn't notice the unnatural pallor of her skin or the way her jaw was beginning to slacken. This is the ultimate, heavily guarded secret to dismantling an abuser, the unfair advantage that victims rarely realize they possess. Narcissists are practically blind. Their absolute, unwavering belief in their own superiority creates a psychological tunnel vision. They are so intoxicated by the sound of their own voice, so obsessed with the script they have written in their own minds, that they stop processing real-time reality. If you want to destroy a monster, you do not fight them. You do not argue with them. You do not try to expose them to their face. You simply become invisible. You agree with them, you validate their delusions, and you quietly grease the wheels of the very machine they are using to run you over. Matthew looked at me, a sharp, authoritative glint in his eye. "Is Claire ready?" "I haven't gone in," I whispered, looking down at the floor, playing my role flawlessly. "Helen said the adults needed to handle her today. I didn't want to trigger another episode. Not after the dress yesterday." "Good girl," Matthew said, the condescension dripping from his teeth. He checked his Rolex. "Dr. Aris will be here in 20 minutes. I'll bring the conservatorship paperwork down to the living room." By 9:45 a.m., Helen was no longer just experiencing a migraine. The massive overdose was reaching its peak. She was sitting rigidly in the velvet chair, her breathing shallow and rapid. Her eyes were locked onto a blank patch of wallpaper, her pupils dilated into massive, dark pools of chemically induced terror. The drug wasn't just a sedative. In overdose quantities, it induced severe akathisia, extreme paranoia, and vivid, waking hallucinations. The exact symptoms they had documented in Claire's medical file to prove her insanity were now systematically hijacking Helen's brain. At exactly 10 a.m., the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the foyer. Matthew strode down the hall and opened the door. Dr. Aris stood on the welcome mat, holding a sleek leather briefcase. He was a man who reeked of expensive compromises, a doctor who had long ago traded his Hippocratic oath for a lucrative career rubber-stamping conservatorships for the wealthy elite. "Matthew," Dr. Aris said, shaking my husband's hand with a solemn, practiced nod. "A difficult day, but you are doing the right thing for her." "Thank you, doctor," Matthew replied, his voice thick with rehearsed grief. "Please, come into the living room. My mother is waiting." They walked into the sprawling, sunlit living room. I trailed a few steps behind them, holding a silver tray of water glasses, the invisible servant fading into the wallpaper. "Helen," Dr. Aris said gently, stepping toward her, "I know how hard this is for a mother." Helen tried to stand. The moment she put weight on her legs, her knees completely buckled. She let out a guttural, slurred gasp and crashed heavily into the glass coffee table, shattering a crystal vase. Matthew froze. Dr. Aris instinctively stepped back, his professional demeanor slipping as Helen scrambled backward across the Persian rug, her fingernails clawing frantically at the wool. "Mom!" Matthew shouted, dropping his files and lunging toward her. "Don't touch me!" Helen shrieked, batting his hands away with wild, uncoordinated swings. Her head whipped violently around the empty room, her eyes tracking horrors that only existed in her poisoned synapses. "The walls! They're bleeding! Matthew, the walls are bleeding!" She's just overwhelmed," Matthew stammered, his face draining of color as he looked up at Dr. Aris in sheer panic. "The stress of committing Claire. She hasn't slept in days." "Matthew, this isn't stress," Dr. Aris said, his voice tightening with genuine medical alarm as he watched Helen gnaw on her own lower lip, her jaw moving in the unmistakable rhythmic spasms of severe neuroleptic toxicity. "She's exhibiting signs of acute delirium. Has she ingested something?" "No! Of course not!" Matthew barked, his pristine composure cracking. He grabbed Helen by the shoulders, shaking her roughly. "Mom, stop it! Look at me! Stop doing this right now!" But Helen was gone. The woman who had ruled this house with an iron fist was reduced to a weeping, shivering mess on the floor, violently swatting at invisible insects crawling up her cashmere sleeves. "I'll go get Claire," Matthew said desperately, standing up and backing away from his mother. He looked at Dr. Aris, his eyes wide with the terror of a man watching his $45 million empire slip through his fingers. "Once you see Claire, you'll understand. My mother is just exhausted from caring for a psychotic patient. I'll bring Claire down." Before Matthew could take a single step toward the staircase, a sound stopped the breath in his lungs. Click, click, click. It was the unmistakable, rhythmic sound of a woman walking in heels on the hardwood floor of the second-story landing. It was not the shuffling, dragging gait of a heavily sedated patient. It was sharp, deliberate, the sound of absolute authority. Every eye in the room darted to the top of the sweeping mahogany staircase. Claire stepped into the light. She wasn't wearing her drab, colorless pajamas. She wasn't slouching. She stood at the top of the stairs like a resurrected queen. The jade-green silk of the dress draped perfectly over her frame, shimmering like liquid emerald in the morning sun. Her hair was brushed and cascading over her shoulders. Her posture was flawless. But it was her eyes that sent a lethal, freezing shockwave through the room. They were completely lucid, blazing with an ancient, so deeply buried fury that had finally broken free from its chemical chains. Matthew physically stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the sofa. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. His jaw opened, but no sound came out. The psychological trigger he had paid to set off had spectacularly backfired. The weapon had turned around and pointed itself directly at his forehead. Dr. Aris looked from the catatonic, hallucinating mother on the floor to the immaculate, poised young woman descending the stairs. The narrative he had been paid to legally authenticate was disintegrating before his eyes. "Good morning, Dr. Aris," Claire said, her voice smooth, articulate, and echoing with chilling clarity across the vaulted foyer. She reached the bottom of the stairs and folded her hands gracefully in front of the jade-green silk. "I apologize for my mother's state. She seems to have accidentally ingested the 14 milligrams of haloperidol she usually grinds into my morning tea." "What?" Dr. Aris gasped, turning to stare at Matthew. "What is she talking about?" "She's insane!" Matthew screamed, a raw, feral sound ripping from his throat. The mask was entirely gone. He was a cornered animal. She's having an episode. Don't listen to a word she says. She's clinically delusional. But the ultimate destruction of Matthew's life didn't come from Claire. It came from the floor. Helen, her brain utterly saturated by the massive dose of antipsychotics, looked up from the Persian rug. Through her dilated, hallucinating eyes, she didn't see her daughter walking toward her in a green dress. Her guilt-ridden, toxic mind projected the only image her subconscious had been running from for 10 years. She saw Lucy Alvarez. "No!" Helen shrieked, a sound of such pure, unadulterated terror that it made the hairs on my arms stand up. She scrambled backward, kicking her legs, pointing a trembling, clawed finger at Claire. "Keep her away! Keep the dead girl away from me!" "Mom, shut up!" Matthew roared, dropping to his knees and trying to clamp his hand over her mouth. But Helen thrashed violently, her drug-addled brain overriding any instinct for self-preservation. "She's bleeding! Matthew, look at the blood! It's on your hands! You hit her! You drove the car! You killed her on the parkway!" Helen wailed, openly sobbing, trying to wipe invisible blood from her own pristine cashmere sweater. "We hid the body. We paid the money. Tell the dead girl to leave us alone." The silence that followed was absolute. The kind of silence that happens immediately after a bomb detonates, right before the shockwave tears the building apart. Dr. Aris was backing away toward the front door, his face pale with horror, his hands trembling as he pulled his cell phone from his pocket. You can ignore a lot of things for a hefty bribe. You can turn a blind eye to a groggy patient. But you cannot ignore a spontaneous, highly detailed confession to vehicular manslaughter and a medical cover-up screamed in the middle of a living room. Matthew realized it. He looked at Dr. Aris, dialing 911, and then he slowly turned his head to look at me. The realization dawned in his eyes, cold and devastating. He looked at the teacup on the counter. He looked at my calm, tearless face. He finally realized that the invisible, subservient wife he thought he controlled had been the architect of his demise. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out the small black digital audio recorder Claire had given me. I held it up in the morning light, letting the red recording light pulse like a heartbeat. "You should probably sit down, Matthew," I said, my voice dropping the meek, submissive octave, ringing out with cold, lethal authority. "The police are going to be here very soon, and we have 10 years of catching up to do." But the smirk I expected to see wiped from Matthew's face didn't disappear. Instead, the raw, feral panic that had briefly shattered his pristine composure slowly began to warp into something else, something far colder and infinitely more dangerous. I watched the gears turning behind his dark eyes. The cornered animal was receding, instantly replaced by the chilling algorithmic calculus of a predator assessing the exits. He didn't look at the pulsing red light of the audio recorder in my hand. He didn't look at his sister standing on the staircase in the jade-green dress. He looked past me. He looked at Dr. Aris. Dr. Aris's thumb was hovering over the cracked screen of his cell phone. The 3 digits, 911, were glowing in the dim morning light filtering through the foyer windows. His finger was trembling, hovering just millimeters above the green call button, but he wasn't pressing it. The silence in the room stretched, pulling so taut I could hear the erratic, shallow wheezing of Helen still clawing at the Persian rug behind us. I watched a silent, horrifying conversation pass between my husband and the state-appointed medical evaluator. It was a look of mutual, catastrophic self-preservation. Dr. Aris had been on Matthew's payroll for years. He had signed his name in State Registry Inc. on dozens of fraudulent competency evaluations. He had legally authenticated the chemical lobotomy of a perfectly sane young woman to secure a $45 million trust. If the police walked through that heavy mahogany door right now, Matthew would be indicted for vehicular manslaughter and false imprisonment. But Dr. Aris? He would be stripped of his medical license, publicly disgraced, and handed a federal prison sentence for criminal conspiracy, medical fraud, and accessory to a decade-long felony. The glowing numbers on the phone screen slowly vanished. Dr. Arris slid the device back into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He took a slow step backward, reached behind him, and turned the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door. The mechanical thud of the lock sliding into place echoed through the vaulted ceiling like a judge's gavel. "Matthew," Dr. Arris said, his voice dropping into a sterile, professional monotone that made the blood freeze in my veins. "If the authorities arrive and find your mother in a state of neuroleptic toxicity, accompanied by an audio recording of this unfortunate conversation, my career is entirely forfeit. We are looking at decades behind bars." Matthew straightened his posture, running a hand over his lapel to smooth out the wrinkles. The transition was terrifying to witness. The man I had slept next to for 3 years vanished, leaving behind an empty, immaculate shell operating on pure sociopathic survival instinct. "I am fully aware of the stakes, Julian," Matthew replied, his tone chillingly conversational, as if they were discussing a slight dip in the stock market rather than a double homicide. "That is precisely why the police aren't coming." The air was instantly sucked out of the room. The trap I had so carefully constructed had just been inverted. I wasn't holding the smoking gun anymore. I was locked inside a soundproof fortress with 2 desperate men who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "It really is a profound tragedy, Doctor," Matthew continued, his dark eyes finally sliding over to meet mine. There was no rage left in them, only a void. "The stress of the impending medical evaluation clearly triggered a massive, violent schizophrenic episode in my poor sister. In her psychosis, she somehow managed to access my mother's medication, heavily lacing her morning tea." "A tragic oversight," Dr. Arris nodded slowly, his eyes darting to the floor, actively collaborating in the fabrication of my death. "Patients with her specific pathology can become dangerously cunning during an acute psychotic break." "Exactly," Matthew said, taking a slow, measured step toward me. "And when my devoted wife, Sophia, realized what was happening, she bravely tried to intervene. But Claire was manic. She possessed an unnatural, adrenaline-fueled strength. She attacked Sophia. By the time I came downstairs, it was too late to save my wife. I had no choice but to use lethal force to stop my sister from murdering you as well, Doctor." "I can certainly corroborate that sequence of events," Dr. Arris whispered, gripping the handle of his briefcase. "I have the medical files right here to prove her escalating history of violent delusions. A clear-cut case of self-defense during a fatal domestic emergency." My mind spun violently. They were going to kill us both. They were going to murder me and Claire right here on the imported rugs, pose our bodies, and the corrupt doctor would sign the official death certificates validating Matthew's story. The justice system wouldn't even blink. The wealthy, grieving son forced to put down his insane sister to save a medical professional. It was a masterpiece of legal immunity. "Run!" Claire screamed from the staircase, lunging downward. But years of muscle atrophy and heavy chemical sedation had taken their toll on her body. Her legs buckled on the bottom step, sending her crashing onto the hardwood floor in a tangle of jade-green silk. Matthew lunged. He didn't move with the clumsy, uncoordinated anger of a normal man. He moved with terrifying, athletic precision. I turned to sprint toward the kitchen, toward the heavy block of chef's knives on the island, but I didn't even make it 3 steps. His hand clamped onto the back of my cardigan, the fabric tearing loudly as he violently yanked me backward. The sheer physical disparity between us was overwhelming. The momentum lifted my feet off the ground, and I was thrown backward, my spine colliding with the edge of the marble entryway console with a sickening crunch. The digital audio recorder flew from my grasp, skittering across the polished floor and sliding underneath a heavy oak credenza, completely out of reach. "Sophia, Sophia, Sophia." Matthew clicked his tongue, looming over me as I gasped for air. The wind entirely knocked out of my lungs. "You were doing so well. You played the sweet, oblivious little charity case to absolute perfection. If you had just stayed in your lane, you could have lived a very comfortable life." I kicked out wildly, my heel connecting with his kneecap. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to scramble sideways. I threw myself toward the living room, my hands slipping on the polished wood. The entire scene had devolved into a surreal, barbaric nightmare. In the center of the room, Helen was still writhing on the floor, weeping and swatting at the empty air, completely oblivious to the fact that her son was actively hunting his wife just 3 feet away. Dr. Aris stood by the front door, his face pale, watching the violence unfold with the detached clinical observation of a man protecting his pension. "Get away from her!" Claire shrieked, dragging herself across the floor and desperately grabbing at Matthew's ankle. He didn't even look down. He simply kicked backward, his heavy leather dress shoe catching Claire in the ribs. She cried out, collapsing back onto the floor, clutching her side as she gasped for breath. "You're pathetic, Matt," I spat, crawling backward until my back hit the cold stone of the fireplace hearth. I reached blindly behind me, my fingers desperately searching the brass tool stand. "You're not a protector. You're just a terrified little boy who hides behind his mother's money." His jaw clenched. The calculated mask finally slipped, revealing the bruised, fragile ego underneath. He stepped over Helen's thrashing legs and walked toward me, his chest heaving. My fingers brushed against cold metal. I gripped the heavy brass handle of the fire poker and swung it outward with every ounce of strength I had left in my shattered body. The heavy iron tip caught him squarely in the ribs. The dull, heavy thud echoed through the room. Matthew doubled over with a sharp gasp, stumbling sideways into the glass coffee table. I scrambled to my feet, my vision swimming with black spots from the pain in my spine. The kitchen was just 10 feet away, the back door, the alarm system. If I could just hit the panic button on the wall, the private security firm would instantly dispatch the local police. Dr. Aris couldn't stop an automated alarm. I sprinted toward the archway, my bare feet slipping on the scattered debris of the broken crystal vase. 9 feet, 8 feet, 7 feet. But a hand, slick with sweat and ironclad with rage, closed entirely around my throat. Matthew slammed me forward, pinning me face first against the heavy granite of the kitchen island. The impact drove the remaining air from my lungs in a violent rush. My hands scrambled uselessly against the smooth stone, the brass fire poker clattering uselessly to the floor. He pressed his entire body weight against my back, trapping me completely. His forearm pressed down against the back of my neck, forcing my cheek flush against the cold granite. I could hear his ragged, stoned, furious breathing directly in my ear. "You really thought you were smarter than me?" Matthew hissed, his voice trembling with a dark, euphoric high of absolute power. "You thought you could walk into my house, drink my wine, spend my money, and then burn my family to the ground?" I choked, my fingers clawing desperately at his forearm, trying to find an inch of space to breathe. Blackness was beginning to creep into the edges of my peripheral vision. The kitchen was spinning. "Dr. Aris!" Matthew called out, his voice terrifyingly steady over the sound of my choking gasps. "Open my mother's purse on the side table. There's a prescription bottle of haloperidol inside. Bring it to me." "What are you doing?" The doctor's voice trembled from the doorway. "I'm establishing the narrative, Julian," Matthew said, leaning his weight harder against my spine. "If Claire forced these pills down my wife's throat during a struggle, the toxicology report will show a massive, fatal overdose in her system. It corroborates the psychosis perfectly." I heard the frantic rustle of leather, the rattle of a plastic pill bottle being opened, footsteps approaching the island. "Open her mouth," Matthew ordered. My hands scrambled wildly, knocking a heavy wooden cutting board off the counter. It crashed to the floor, but Matthew didn't even flinch. He grabbed a fistful of my hair, yanking my head backward to expose my throat, his fingers prying at my jaw with bruising, mechanical force. I stared up at the pristine, recessed lighting of the kitchen ceiling. The world was fading. The carefully constructed trap had failed, and the monster was securing his crown. Dr. Aris's trembling hand hovered over my face, the white, chalky pills resting in his palm, ready to pour the lethal dose directly down my throat. "Say goodnight to the doctor, Sophia," Matthew whispered, his grip tightening as the shadow of his hand completely eclipsed the light. The chalky dust of the pulverized pills brushed against my lower lip. Dr. Eris's trembling fingers pried at my jaw, his breathing ragged, emitting the sour, metallic scent of sheer cowardice. Matthew's forearm pressed harder into my cervical spine, a calculated, steady pressure designed to snap my resistance. In his mind, the script was already finalized. The ink was dry. I was going to swallow the poison, my heart would stop, and he would step over my corpse to sign the paperwork for a $45 million empire. He was so intoxicated by his own perceived omnipotence that he completely forgot the cardinal rule of playing God. Gods don't bleed, but men do, and men who build their kingdoms on glass are always shattered by the very stones they throw. I didn't try to claw at Matthew's arm anymore. I let my muscles go entirely slack, feigning a sudden, overwhelming syncope. The abrupt drop in my physical resistance caught him off guard. For a microsecond, the suffocating pressure on my neck loosened as Matthew shifted his weight to compensate for my dead weight drop. In that microscopic window of arrogant negligence, I didn't reach for my throat. I reached my right hand backward, my fingers curling around the heavy, jagged shard of broken crystal from the vase Helen had shattered on the floor just minutes ago. I didn't hesitate. I drove the jagged edge backward, burying it deep into the soft, fleshy meat of Matthew's thigh. The monstrous, feral roar that erupted from his lungs shook the expensive pendant lights above the island. The crushing weight instantly vanished from my back as Matthew reeled backward, clutching his leg, the blood immediately blooming through the expensive wool of his tailored suit. Dr. Eris shrieked, dropping the handful of haloperidol pills. They scattered across the pristine marble countertops like useless white pebbles. The cowardly doctor stumbled backward, slipping in his own panic, his back hitting the stainless steel refrigerator. I scrambled off the granite, gasping violently for air, my throat burning as oxygen flooded my starved lungs. I spun around, clutching the edge of the counter to stay upright. Son Matthew was on one knee, his face twisted in a grotesque mask of agony and pure, homicidal rage. He pulled the bloody crystal shard from his leg, his chest heaving, his eyes locking onto mine with the dark, empty void of a man who had finally abandoned all pretense of humanity. "You're dead," he rasped, his voice a wet, guttural hiss. He began to stand, ignoring the blood pouring down his leg, limping heavily toward me. "I don't need the pills. I don't need a medical excuse. I will snap your neck with my bare hands and tell them you attacked my mother." "Matthew, stop!" Dr. Aris pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "The plan is ruined. We have to leave. We have to get out of here." "Nobody is leaving," Matthew roared, swatting the doctor backward with a violent backhand. So he turned his dead eyes back to me, raising his bloody hands. "You think you're so clever, Sophia? You think a piece of broken glass changes anything? You're in my house, my fortress. No one can hear you." He was right about one thing. It was his fortress. But he was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong about who was listening. Just as Matthew lunged forward, his hands outstretched to wrap around my throat for the final time, the heavy, reinforced oak of the front door didn't just open, it exploded. The deafening, percussive blast of a tactical battering ram shattered the brass deadbolt, ripping the hinges entirely out of the doorframe. The heavy wood crashed onto the imported tiles of the foyer with the force of a bomb detonating. Matthew froze mid-lunge, his bloody hands hovering in the air, a flood of black tactical gear. Kevlar vests and heavy flashlights surged into the hallway. "Police! Get on the ground! Show me your hands!" The sheer volume of the intrusion was paralyzing. 4 heavily armed officers poured into the living room, their weapons instantly trained on the bleeding, towering figure of my husband. Matthew's pristine composure didn't just crack, it vaporized. The untouchable, wealthy patriarch of coastal Connecticut evaporated into the humid air, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, trembling boy. He slowly raised his bloody hands, his eyes darting frantically around the room, trying to process the impossible velocity of his own destruction. Officers, listen to me," Matthew stammered, his voice instantly reverting to the smooth, practiced cadence of a man who believed his tax bracket made him immune to the law. "Thank God you're here. My wife. My wife is having a violent psychotic break. She stabbed me. My mother is on the floor. She was poisoned by my sister. I was just trying to defend my family." He pointed a trembling, blood-stained finger at me. "Arrest her, please. She's insane." One of the officers stepped forward, but he didn't reach for his handcuffs to bind me. He violently grabbed Matthew by the collar of his ruined suit, spun him around, and slammed him face first into the very granite island where he had just tried to murder me. The sound of his cheek hitting the stone was a symphony of profound, long-awaited justice. "Matthew Sterling," the lead detective said, his voice cold and devoid of any respect for the mansion he was standing in. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "On what grounds?" Matthew screamed, thrashing against the cold stone as the heavy steel cuffs were ratcheted tightly around his wrists. "This is my house. You have no warrant. You have no proof of anything." "Actually," a deep, weary but incredibly firm voice echoed from the shattered doorway, "we have about 3 hours of it." The officers parted slightly, allowing a figure to step into the chaotic living room. Mr. Alvarez. He walked slowly, his weathered face illuminated by the harsh, flashing blue and red lights of the cruisers parked on the manicured lawn outside. In his hand, he held a small black receiver module, the exact matching pair to the microtransmitter Claire had pressed into my palm at 4 in the morning. "A microtransmitter doesn't just record audio to a hard drive, Matthew," Mr. Alvarez said, his voice echoing with the heavy, solemn weight of a 10-year vigil finally coming to an end. "It broadcasts live, on a secure radio frequency. I have been sitting in an unmarked police surveillance van at the end of your gated driveway since 5 o'clock this morning. We heard every word. We heard you admit to the poisoning. We heard you admit to the hit and run. We heard you instruct a corrupt doctor to force a lethal overdose down your wife's throat." Mr. Alvarez stepped closer, looking down at the man who had crushed his daughter's life out of existence on a rainy highway a decade ago. "You didn't build a fortress, Matthew. You built your own prison cell, and you handed us the microphone." Matthew's face, pressed against the granite, contorted into a mask of absolute, paralyzing horror. The algorithmic calculus in his eyes completely short-circuited. There was no loophole. There was no high-priced lawyer who could unsay the words he had confidently broadcasted to an entire squad of homicide detectives. Across the room, 2 paramedics were lifting Dr. Aris off the floor, placing him in handcuffs while he openly wept, babbling about a plea deal. 2 other medics were gently securing Helen onto a stretcher. She was still completely lost in her chemical nightmare, screaming about dead girls and bloody bicycles as they strapped her down, a poetic, tragic irony that she was now bound by the exact same restraints she had forced upon her own daughter for 10 years. But the true closure, the absolute breaking of the curse, came from the floor by the staircase. A female officer gently helped Claire to her feet. The jade-green silk was torn at the hem, and she was clutching her bruised ribs where Matthew had kicked her, but she refused the stretcher. She stood tall, her spine straight, looking at her brother as he was hauled up from the counter by the police. Matthew looked at her, his eyes wide, silently begging for the submissive, traumatized puppet he had created to intervene. "Claire," he whispered, a pathetic, desperate croak. "Claire, please. You know I love you. I was just trying to protect you." "You yelled on the phone that Sophia killed your sister, Matt," Claire said softly, her voice carrying a haunting, beautiful clarity that cut entirely through the chaos of the room. She stepped closer to him, the jade-green dress shimmering under the police lights. "You were right. The sick, terrified, broken girl you built. She died today. You killed her." Claire looked him dead in the eye, a decade of stolen life finally reclaimed. But I survived. Enjoy your cage, Matthew. I hear the walls are terribly thin. She turned her back on him. She didn't look back as the officers dragged my husband out the front door, his desperate, screaming protests fading into the crisp morning air, drowned out by the wail of the approaching ambulance sirens. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the Connecticut estate seemed to instantly evaporate, leaving behind nothing but the quiet, settling dust of a ruined empire. I slumped against the kitchen counter, my knees finally giving out. Mr. Alvarez rushed forward, catching me by the shoulders and gently helping me to a chair. He looked at me, his deep, sad eyes brimming with unshed tears, and simply squeezed my hand. A silent, profound acknowledgement between two strangers who had walked into the mouth of hell and dragged the devil out into the light. Claire walked over to me. She looked at the torn collar of my cardigan, the bruises blooming on my neck, and the exhaustion etched deep into my face. She reached out and wrapped her arms around my shoulders, burying her face in my neck. "We did it," she whispered, her tears warm against my skin. "We're free." I hugged her back, closing my eyes, the first genuine, unburdened breath I had taken in 3 years filling my lungs. In the months that followed, the grand, imposing facade of the Sterling family was meticulously dismantled by the justice system. The audio recordings, combined with Dr. Aris's desperate, sprawling confession to avoid a maximum sentence, provided an airtight case. Matthew was indicted on charges of vehicular manslaughter, attempted murder, felony forgery, and a litany of financial crimes related to the conservatorship. He pleaded guilty to avoid a highly publicized trial. The man who had worn bespoke suits and commanded boardrooms traded his tailored wool for a state-issued jumpsuit, sentenced to 25 years without the possibility of parole. Helen never stood trial. The massive overdose of antipsychotics, combined with her underlying frailty, caused severe, irreversible neurological damage. The state deemed her medically unfit to participate in her own defense. She was permanently remanded to a high-security, state-run psychiatric facility, a cold, sterile building where the windows were barred. The doors were locked from the outside, and the nurses administered her daily medication in tiny paper cups. She spent her final days trapped in her own mind, wandering the linoleum halls, forever swatting at invisible ghosts in jade-green dresses. She built her own hell, and the universe graciously allowed her to live in it. The conservatorship was immediately nullified by a probate judge. Claire was granted full, unrestricted access to her trust, her life, and her autonomy. But she didn't keep the estate. She sold the sprawling Connecticut mansion to a commercial developer, taking the millions and quietly funding a private foundation dedicated to providing legal and psychiatric advocacy for victims of medical and familial abuse. She also established a massive, anonymous scholarship fund at the Yale School of Education in the name of Lucy Alvarez. As for me, I walked away with the only thing I had ever truly wanted, my freedom and the undeniable clarity of my own strength. We are taught to fear the shadows. We are taught to check the locks on our doors, to look over our shoulders in dark parking lots, to be wary of strangers with rough hands and harsh voices. We spend our lives preparing for the monsters that look like monsters, but the most dangerous predators do not break into your home. They hand you a key, they give you a ring, they promise you safety, and they slowly, meticulously build a cage so luxurious, so heavily gilded with societal respectability that you don't even realize you're a prisoner until the air is already running out. True evil is not the absence of light. It is the illusion of it. It is the polished smile that masks a decaying soul. It is the quiet, methodical destruction of a human spirit, justified by greed and protected by the absolute arrogance of power. But there is a fatal flaw in the architecture of every tyrant. They rely on the silence of their victims. They depend on the terrifying assumption that the people they have broken will remain forever afraid of the dark. They forget that when you force a person into the absolute suffocating depths of the abyss, they don't just learn how to survive in the dark, they learn how to see in it. And when they finally find their way back to the surface, they do not come back to ask for their freedom. They come back to burn the cage to the ground. The fire we started that morning in the foyer left no physical ash, but the smoke of it lingered in our lungs for a very long time. Society loves to sell us the cinematic version of freedom, the grand, sweeping moment where the police sirens fade into the distance, the sun breaks through the clouds, and the victim instantly morphs into a triumphant survivor. But the reality of escaping a sociopath is far less glamorous and infinitely more grueling. Freedom is not a sudden burst of sunlight. It is the slow, agonizing process of learning how to breathe again without flinching. For the first 6 months in my new apartment, the silence was deafening. It was a heavy, unfamiliar quiet that set my nerves on edge. I used to wake up at 3 in the morning, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, lying perfectly still in the dark as my brain actively hallucinated the sound of Matthew's heavy, judgmental footsteps pacing in the hallway. I would stare at the shadows thrown across my ceiling, waiting for the doorknob to turn, waiting for the condescending sigh, waiting for the masterfully crafted lie that would make me question my own sanity. It took nearly a year before I could pour myself a simple cup of chamomile tea without staring into the amber liquid, half expecting to see a thick, chalky residue settling at the bottom. Trauma is a stubborn, parasitic ghost. It doesn't care if you have changed the locks, blocked the numbers, or put a state penitentiary between you and your abuser. It embeds itself in your cellular memory, reminding you that the world is entirely capable of wearing a tailored suit while hiding a butcher knife behind its back. But I was not navigating the dark alone. Claire's journey back to herself was a fragile, terrifying rebirth. When the state finally intervened and transferred her to a highly specialized neurological rehabilitation center, the true horror of Helen's chemical imprisonment became agonizingly clear. Withdrawing from a decade of forced high-potency antipsychotics is not merely a psychological hurdle. It is a violent, physiological exorcism. I sat by her bedside for weeks, holding her hand as her body revolted against the sudden absence of the poison. There were night sweats that soaked through the mattress, violently shaking tremors that rattled her teeth, and sheer, unfiltered neurological shock as her brain began to process raw emotions at full volume for the first time since she was 16 years old. I held the plastic basin when the nausea overtook her. I wiped the cold sweat from her forehead with a damp cloth. And in those quiet, grueling hours, I realized the stark, devastating difference between Helen's performance of care and the actual grueling work of love. Helen had weaponized a mother's touch to bury her child alive. I was using a stranger's hands to dig her out. The first time Claire genuinely smiled, not the strained, terrified grimace of a captive, but a real, spontaneous reflex of joy, was on a Tuesday afternoon. We were sitting in the courtyard of the rehab center, and a small, chaotic gust of wind blew a stray newspaper directly into my face, knocking my coffee into my lap. I sputtered, cursing loudly, and from across the wrought iron table a soft, musical sound erupted from Claire's chest. It was a laugh. A real, unburdened laugh that echoed through the courtyard like a triumphant bell. I didn't care about the ruined shirt. I sat there, wiping the spilled coffee from my jeans, watching her eyes crinkle with genuine amusement, and I knew with absolute certainty that we had won. Matthew, meanwhile, discovered exactly what happens to a god when he is stripped of his kingdom. 6 months into his sentence, I received a letter. The envelope was standard, cheap facility paper, stamped with the insignia of the state penitentiary. Seeing his sharp, meticulously practiced handwriting on the front triggered a momentary spike of that old, conditioned dread. I sat at my kitchen counter, holding the envelope, feeling the phantom weight of his manipulative aura trying to reach through the paper. I opened it. It was a masterpiece of narcissistic delusion. 4 pages of dense, sprawling text detailing how I had ruined his life, how he was the true victim of a broken system, and how his only crime was loving his family too fiercely. He spoke of the food in prison, The indignity of his cell, the betrayal he felt. There was not a single sentence, not a single syllable dedicated to Lucy Alvarez, or to the decade he stole from his own sister. He was still entirely trapped in his own script, playing the misunderstood martyr to an audience of one. I didn't burn the letter. I didn't tear it up. I simply read it, folded it neatly back into its envelope, and dropped it into the trash can next to coffee grounds and eggshells. That was the moment I realized the tether was truly severed. The ultimate victory over a narcissistic abuser isn't hatred, and it isn't revenge. It is absolute, unwavering indifference. He was no longer a monster looming over my life. He was just a pathetic, incredibly small man locked in a concrete box, screaming into a void that no longer cared to listen. The family we built from the wreckage of the Sterling Empire was deeply unconventional, forged not by blood, but by fire. Anthony Alvarez became the steadfast, quiet anchor in our lives. He didn't just extract justice for his murdered daughter, he gained two fiercely loyal survivors. On the first anniversary of Matthew's conviction, the three of us drove out to the small, sunlit cemetery where Lucy was buried. It was a brisk autumn afternoon, the leaves burning in brilliant shades of copper and gold. Claire walked ahead of us, carrying a massive bouquet of wild, unmanicured sunflowers. She knelt by the polished marble headstone, the wind catching her long hair, and gently placed the flowers against the engraved letters. She stayed there for a long time, her shoulders trembling slightly, offering an apology that was never truly hers to make, but one her soul desperately needed to give. Mr. Alvarez walked up behind her. He didn't say a word. He simply placed his large, weathered hand on the crown of her head, his fingers smoothing her hair in a gesture of profound, unconditional absolution. The father who had lost everything, comforting the girl who had been used as the weapon. I stood a few feet back, watching them, feeling a profound, aching beauty in the resilience of the human spirit. The Sterling family had tried to bury all of us under the weight of their gilded lies, but we had become the seeds that broke the concrete. People often ask me, when I share fragments of this story, how I didn't see the truth sooner. They ask how I could sleep next to a monster, how I could sit at a dining table with a woman actively poisoning her child and not feel the venom in the air. It is the most common, fundamental misunderstanding of abuse. The devil does not come to you with horns and a pitchfork. He does not announce his intentions with a sinister laugh. He comes to you with a charming smile, a stable career, and a narrative of protection so intensely intoxicating that you willingly hand him the keys to your autonomy. The cage is never built overnight. It is constructed one invisible bar at a time. It begins with a dismissed feeling, an invalidated memory, a quiet suggestion that you are overreacting. You're being hysterical, Sophia. You misunderstood the situation. Honey, you're so lucky to have a family that takes care of you. They slowly recalibrate your internal compass until north points directly to them. They isolate you in luxury, wrapping you in expensive silk and false security until you completely forget how to trust your own instincts. Gaslighting is not merely the act of lying, it is the systematic, calculated dismantling of your reality until you are forced to rely entirely on the abuser's version of the truth to survive. You might be sitting in a beautifully furnished room right now, listening to this, feeling a sudden, icy knot forming in the pit of your stomach. You might be looking at the locked drawers in your own home, the unaccounted hours, the sudden bursts of irrational anger from the person sleeping down the hall. You might be making excuses for them because acknowledging the alternative, that the person who swore to protect you is actually the one holding the leash, is a horror too vast to comprehend. Do not ignore that knot. Do not let the comfort of a routine, the allure of financial stability, or the fear of a messy public fallout convince you that your instincts are broken. If you feel like you are walking on eggshells in your own home, if your reality is constantly being rewritten to make you the villain, you are not crazy. You are being hunted, and the longer you stay quiet, the tighter the bars become. The truth is a terrifying, brutal weapon, but it is the only thing capable of cutting through the dark. You are not a supporting character in a narcissist's tragedy. You are the author of your own survival. You have the power to stop swallowing the poison, to stop playing the role they assigned to you, and to step out of the shadows. If this story resonated with you, if you felt the cold breath of recognition anywhere in these words, do not stay silent. Leave a trace. Hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who might be silently suffocating in a gilded cage of their own. Join this community of truth seekers, because the only way to dismantle an empire built on deception is to shine a blinding light directly into its foundation. You are stronger than the narrative they forced upon you. Take your pen back and start writing your freedom.